Would you let your blood steal what was rightfully yours? Would you watch in silence as your legacy was stripped away simply because of the color of your skin? London Hart had no choice. She sat motionless in the grand mahogany courtroom, the air thick with tension. Every eye was on her, but she felt invisible, just as they had always wanted her to be. Across from her, her father's family sat with smug expressions, their expensive suits and designer dresses a stark reminder of the wealth they had hoarded for generations. The judge cleared his throat, shuffling through papers before speaking. Based on the presented will and testimony, the estate of the late William Hart III shall be transferred entirely to his children, Walter Hart Jr. and Charlotte Hart Montgomery. A murmur rippled through the room, but London barely registered it. She was frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Not a single mention of her name. She wasn't surprised, but the blatant injustice still burned like fire in her veins. Her father, William Hart III, had been a wealthy real estate mogul, a man of power and influence, but he had also been a man of secrets. London had been born from his affair with her black mother, an affair that his wealthy, white Southern family had buried like a dirty secret. And now, they were burying her along with it. The moment the will was read, her half-siblings exchanged victorious glances. Walter Jr., a middle-aged man with graying temples, gave her a smirk as if daring her to protest. Charlotte, dripping in pearls and entitlement, barely spared her a glance. London gritted her teeth. This wasn't just about money. This was about erasing her existence. Her father had promised her that she would be taken care of, that he had made arrangements, but the paper in front of her said otherwise. There was no way he had simply forgotten to include her. Someone had tampered with his will. She clenched her fists under the table. They thought they had won. They thought she was powerless. They had no idea who they were dealing with. London had spent her entire life fighting to prove she belonged. Growing up, she had never been accepted by her father's family. Her mother had struggled to provide for her after her father refused to acknowledge her publicly. And yet, London had built herself up. She had worked 3 jobs to put herself through law school. She had fought tooth and nail for every opportunity, knowing that one day she would carve her place in this world. And now, they had taken everything from her. With her inheritance stolen, she was left with nothing but her name. No money, no assets. And as if fate wanted to twist the knife even deeper, the law firm she worked for, owned by none other than her father's business partners, conveniently found a reason to terminate her contract the same week. Coincidence? Not a chance. London walked out of the courthouse that evening with nothing but the weight of betrayal pressing on her shoulders. The city lights of Atlanta flickered around her, but she felt suffocated by the darkness closing in. Where would she go? What could she do? She had no allies, no resources, only revenge. For weeks, London disappeared. She crashed on a friend's couch for a while, spent nights in cheap motel, and at one point, even slept in her car. But she never let the bitterness consume her. She spent every waking moment strategizing, studying, investigating. If she had learned anything from the Harts, it was that power wasn't just about money. It was about knowledge, leverage, and playing the long game. She started with her father's business empire. Hart Enterprises was a multi-billion-dollar corporation built on real estate, investment, and political influence. It had been in the family for over a century, controlled by men who looked exactly like Walter and Charlotte. Men who thought people like her had no place at their table. But London knew something they didn't. Secrets always had a price. She dug through old records, private dealings, and hidden transactions. She reached out to past employees, former business partners, and anyone who'd been wronged by the Hart family. And she found it. A single crack in their perfect empire. A crack wide enough to bring it all crumbling down. 1 year later, the Harts had all but forgotten about her. Walter Jr. had taken over as CEO of Hart Enterprises. Charlotte had expanded their empire, using their stolen fortune to fund political campaigns and high society events. They had everything. And then, one by one, they started losing it. First, an anonymous whistleblower leaked documents revealing years of financial fraud within Hart Enterprises. Then, the IRS launched an investigation. Then, Key investors began pulling out, one after another, until the company's stock value plummeted overnight. And then came the lawsuits. One by one, former employees stepped forward, exposing the company's discriminatory hiring practices, illegal dealings, and under-the-table bribes. It was a public scandal of catastrophic proportions. And at the center of it all, London Hart. She hadn't just found the cracks in their empire. She had turned them into earthquakes. But her revenge wasn't finished yet. Because just as Walter and Charlotte sat in their boardroom, desperately trying to save what was left of their fortune, a final blow came in the form of a takeover bid. A billionaire investor had stepped forward, offering to buy out Hart Enterprises. An investor who had remained anonymous until the day of the deal, when London walked into the boardroom, dressed in the very suit they had once mocked her for wearing. She saw the blood drain from their faces, and then she smiled. "Hello, Walter. Charlotte." She took her seat at the head of the table. "Let's talk business." London Hart should have felt victorious. She had spent over a year tearing apart the empire that had once excluded her. She had forced her racist half-siblings, Walter Jr. and Charlotte, into financial ruin, exposing their corrupt dealings to the world. And now, she was sitting at the very table they once used to decide her fate. But power didn't come without a cost. As she sat in the grand boardroom of Hart Enterprises, watching Walter and Charlotte scramble to save what little remained of their wealth, she realized that the game wasn't over yet. It had only just begun, because the system wasn't built for people like her to win. And now, the system was about to strike back. It started slowly at first, like whispers in the wind. A mistake at the bank caused her assets to be frozen temporarily. A lawsuit, filed by a concerned shareholder, suddenly put a hold on her takeover of Hart Enterprises. Then came the rumors. Anonymous articles spread across the internet, accusing her of fraud, claiming she had manipulated financial records to destroy Walter and Charlotte. Journalists who had once begged her for interviews were now turning against her, questioning whether she had truly earned her success. And then the final blow came. The IRS opened an investigation, not on the Harts, on her. London stared at the letter in disbelief. According to the notice, she was being audited for suspicious financial activity over the past year. The very same tactics she had used to dismantle Hart Enterprises, tracing financial misconduct, moving money through legal loopholes, and exposing fraudulent accounts, were now being used against her. It didn't matter that she had played by the same rules as every other billionaire. It didn't matter that Walter and Charlotte had done far worse for decades. The moment a black woman entered the game, the rules changed, and the system was making sure she lost. London's bank accounts were frozen indefinitely. Her business partners, fearful of being associated with her legal troubles, cut ties with her one by one. And then came the eviction notice. With her accounts locked, she couldn't pay the mortgage on her penthouse. The very empire she had fought to build was now crumbling beneath her. By the time she stepped out of her luxury high-rise, a single suitcase in hand, the press was already waiting. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in her face. "Ms. Hart, how do you respond to the allegations? Do you regret going after your father's family? Did you really think you could win?" London kept walking, forcing herself to remain calm. But inside, she was screaming. She had spent her entire life proving she was just as good, no better, than the people who had tried to erase her. She had won against impossible odds. And yet, here she was, homeless, broke, alone. The system had chewed her up and spat her out. And for the first time in her life, she wondered if she had made a mistake. There was only one person left to turn to, Carter Williams. They had met years ago in law school, two underdogs fighting their way to the top. He had been her closest friend, her confidant. When she lost everything, he was the only one who stayed, or so she thought. Carter welcomed her into his home, a modest two-bedroom apartment in downtown Atlanta. It wasn't the luxury she was used to, but she was grateful. For the first few weeks, things were fine. She took a job at a local diner, waiting tables for minimum wage just to survive. It was humiliating, going from billion-dollar deals to scraping together tips, but she swallowed her pride. She had faced worse. Then, one night, She overheard a conversation that shattered everything. Carter was on the phone in the next room, his voice low but urgent. "She's not a threat anymore," he whispered. "She lost everything." The lawsuit worked. London felt the air leave her lungs. Carter, the only person she trusted, had betrayed her. She forced herself to listen, her heart pounding. "Yeah, I'll make sure she doesn't fight back," he continued. "Just keep my name out of it." London's hands clenched into fists. It all made sense now. The legal attack against her, the rumors, the frozen accounts. Carter hadn't just abandoned her. He had helped destroy her, and she had been sleeping under the same roof as the enemy. London didn't confront him. Not yet. She waited until he left for work the next morning before slipping out the door. She had nothing. No money, no home, no allies. But she had something far more dangerous. Rage. They had taken everything from her. But they had forgotten one thing. London Hart didn't lose. She learned, and she was about to make them all regret underestimating her. Again, London Hart had been betrayed before. By her father, by his family, by the very system that claimed to uphold justice. But Carter? That one cut deep. She walked the streets of Atlanta with nothing but the clothes on her back, her heart pounding with fury. Her once glamorous life had crumbled to dust, and now she was no better than the people who scraped by on the margins of society. Homeless, jobless, with a bank account frozen tighter than a corpse in a morgue. She needed a way back in, not just for herself, for revenge. But how? The city had a heartbeat of its own, one that London had ignored when she was at the top. But now, she saw it for what it was. She walked through neighborhoods she had once driven past without a second thought, taking in the reality of the people who had been left behind. The unemployed, the evicted, the desperate, people like her. It was in one of these places, a rundown internet cafe filled with people escaping the cold, that she found her first clue. London had spent days bouncing between libraries, public Wi-Fi spots, and coffee shops, trying to access what little of her network was still intact. But every time she tried logging into her accounts, she hit a dead end. Carter had made sure she was locked out of everything. But if Carter had worked against her, that meant he had been working for someone. And if there was one thing London had learned about corruption, it was that the people at the top always left a trail. She just had to follow it. She dug into Carter's financials first. He had always been careful, never flaunting his wealth. But London knew him better than anyone. She knew his habits, his weaknesses. And one of those weaknesses, he couldn't resist a fast payday. It took her 2 days of searching, but she finally found it. A suspicious wire transfer made to a shell company registered under an obscure offshore bank. The amount? $500,000. The sender? Hart Enterprises. Her breath caught in her throat. Carter hadn't just betrayed her. He had been paid to do it. She stared at the screen, her fingers trembling. They had destroyed her life, taken everything from her, and paid someone to make sure she never fought back. But in doing so, they had made one fatal mistake. They had left a trail. And now, London had her way in. The deeper she dug, the more she uncovered. The shell company that had wired Carter's bribe money, it wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a pattern. Dozens of similar transactions. Millions of dollars moving through offshore accounts. And then, buried deep in financial reports spanning years, London found something impossible. A forgotten trust fund. Her father had set it up decades ago, long before he died. It was supposed to be hers. Money meant to support her in case anything ever happened. But Walter and Charlotte had hidden it. They had illegally transferred the assets into shell companies, draining it bit by bit over the years, assuming she would never find out. But now she knew, and she had proof. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was a legal loophole that could destroy them. Because under Georgia state law, fraudulent concealment of an inheritance was a felony. If she played this right, Walter and Charlotte weren't just going to lose money. They were going to prison. London needed leverage. She couldn't walk into a courtroom with nothing but accusations. No, she needed undeniable proof. She needed witnesses. And most importantly, she needed someone on the inside. That's when she remembered Madeleine Kane. Madeleine had been her father's personal accountant for over 20 years before she was mysteriously fired right after his death. At the time, London hadn't thought much of it, but now it was clear Madeleine had known too much. And if London was right, she might still have the missing paper trail that could bring the entire Hart Empire crashing down. Finding Madeleine wasn't easy. She had disappeared after her termination, leaving no trace of her former life. But people in the shadows knew where to look. London tracked her to a small bookstore in Savannah, tucked away on a quiet street. The woman who answered the door was older now, with weary eyes and a cautious expression. "I knew this day would come," Madeleine said before London could even speak. London froze. "You knew?" Madeleine sighed, motioning for her to come inside. "I knew your father had left something for you, and I knew Walter and Charlotte would do anything to make sure you never got it." London's heart pounded. "You have proof?" Madeleine nodded slowly, and then she pulled out a USB drive. London reached for it, but Madeleine tightened her grip. "I kept this for years, waiting for the right time," she said. "But if I give it to you now, you have to promise me something." "Anything. You finish this." London met her gaze. She thought about all the nights she had spent sleeping in her car, all the doors that had been slammed in her face, all the people who had laughed at her downfall. And then she thought about Walter and Charlotte, living their lives untouched while she had been left to suffer. London took the USB. "I'll finish it," she said. The moment London plugged the USB into a laptop at an old cyber cafe, her world shifted. It wasn't just proof of the stolen trust fund. It was everything. Tax fraud, money laundering, secret bribes to city officials. It wasn't just a loophole. It was a smoking gun. London could end them with this. Her hands shook as she scrolled through files. This was more than she had ever expected, more than she had ever hoped for. She had them. She had won. And then her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A distorted voice came through the line. "I know what you found." London's blood ran cold. "If you use it," the voice continued, "you won't live to see the end of this." The call disconnected. London's breath hitched. She looked around the cafe. Had someone been watching her? Had she just walked into a trap? The Harts were evil, but this was bigger than them. And for the first time in her life, London realized she wasn't just fighting a family. She was fighting something far worse. London Hart sat in a dimly lit motel room, staring at the USB drive like it was a live grenade. The files on that drive weren't just evidence of fraud. They were leverage. But that phone call, someone powerful was watching her. Someone who didn't want this information to see the light of day. She was standing on the edge of something far bigger than an inheritance battle. And now she had a choice. She could run, hide, pretend she never found evidence. Or she could play the game and win. London didn't trust easily, but there was one person she knew hated the Harts just as much as she did. Marissa Caldwell, a ruthless, no-nonsense investigative journalist who had spent the last decade exposing corruption. Marissa had once tried to dig into Hart Enterprises, only to have her career nearly destroyed. Now, London was offering her the story of a lifetime. She reached out through a secure burner phone. The response was immediate. "Meet me in 24 hours. Bring everything." They met in an abandoned warehouse, neutral ground. London laid out the evidence, watching as Marissa's sharp eyes scanned the documents, her expression unreadable. Then, she leaned back with a slow smirk. This is a nuclear bomb." London nodded. "But I can't just drop this in press. They'll bury the story before it even prints." Marissa studied her. "You need more than exposure," she said. "You need to make them pay." London exhaled. "That's why I called you." Marissa nodded. Then, she slid a second USB drive across the table. London frowned. "What's this?" Marissa's smirk widened. "Your next move." The drive contained something London never expected. A list of every politician, banker, and businessman the Harts had ever bribed. Names, dates, transactions, everything. This, Marissa said, is how you take them down. London's mind raced. With this information, she could do more than expose Walter and Charlotte. She could destroy everyone who had helped them, but the real power came from threatening to expose it. She needed money, influence, protection, and now she had the ultimate bargaining chip. She just needed to play it right. London spent the next 2 weeks reaching out to some of the very people on that list, those with just enough power to fear exposure, but not enough to crush her outright. She made her terms clear: a $10 million fund to compensate for what was stolen from her. In return, she would delete their names from her files. Some refused, some threatened her, but a few, they paid. And just like that, London Hart went from penniless to a multi-millionaire overnight. But the best part? She hadn't even touched the real evidence yet. She was just getting started. London was preparing to leave the country, to lay low before her next move, when she received an anonymous package at her motel. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, and when she read it, her heart nearly stopped. "You're not the only heir." London's hands trembled. Her father had only one child, right? Then, who the hell were they talking about? London Hart read the note again. "You're not the only heir." Her pulse thundered in her ears. Her father had only one child. He had told her that himself. Hadn't he? The walls of her motel room felt like they were closing in. She thought she had finally gained the upper hand. Money, power, leverage. But now, someone was trying to rewrite her past, and she had no idea who. She needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. She had to confront the people who had stolen her legacy: Walter and Charlotte Hart. London knew she couldn't just waltz into Hart Estate, demanding answers. She had to be strategic. So she sent an invitation instead. A simple, elegant note delivered by courier. "Let's talk. I know everything. You have one chance to make this right." The response came within hours. A meeting, midnight, at the Hart Estate. It reeked of a trap, but London wasn't afraid, because this time, she was the one holding all the cards. The estate was just as she remembered: cold, elegant, soulless. Walter and Charlotte sat in the grand study, their expressions unreadable as she walked in. "You have some nerve coming here," Walter sneered. Charlotte sipped her wine, her gaze sharp. "Enjoying your little spending spree, London? It won't last." London smirked and set the USB drive on the table. "Your confidence is cute," she said, "but let's cut the games. I know about the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the bribes, and if you don't cooperate, I'll make sure everyone else knows too." Walter's face paled. Charlotte, however, remained eerily calm. "I assume you want money?" she mused. London leaned in. "I want the truth." Charlotte arched a brow. "About what?" London slid the note across the table. Charlotte read it. Then she laughed. Cold, hollow. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "You really think you were your father's only mistake?" London's breath caught. Charlotte's eyes gleamed with amusement. "Your father had another child," she said. "A son, and he left everything to him." London's world tilted. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible." Walter spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel. "Check your facts, girl. You were never meant to inherit anything." London felt sick. Had she been fighting for a fortune that was never hers to begin with? Or worse, had she been played again? Before London could respond, she heard the click of a gun. She turned and found herself staring down the barrel of a pistol, held by Carter, her ex-fiancé. London's stomach dropped. "Carter," she breathed. "What are you doing?" Carter smirked, cleaning up a loose end. And then he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out. London felt the air shift, the sheer force of it slicing past her like a whisper of death. But she didn't fall, because she wasn't the one who had been hit. Carter's smirk vanished as a spray of red bloomed across his chest. His knees buckled, The gun slipped from his grip, clattering onto the marble floor. London turned in shock. Standing in the shadows, Marissa Caldwell, gun smoking, eyes like steel. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "I told you," Marissa said, looking down at Carter's crumpled body. "You picked the wrong woman to betray." London's breath came in shaky gasps. She had been seconds away from dying, and Marissa had saved her life. Charlotte and Walter sat frozen, their shock barely concealed beneath their well-rehearsed masks of power. London wiped the sweat from her brow and faced them. "Now," she said, voice unwavering, "let's talk about that other heir." Walter scoffed, but Charlotte looked worried, which meant she was lying. London's mind sharpened. If there was another heir, why had the Harts gone through so much trouble to erase her? It didn't add up. She turned to Marissa. "Can you fact-check them?" Marissa smirked. "Already did." She tossed a thick manila folder onto the table. Walter's face went white. Charlotte flinched. London flipped open the file, and her entire world shifted. There was no son, no secret heir, no long-lost brother. It was a lie, a fabrication designed to keep her from fighting for what was rightfully hers. London's jaw clenched. She had spent years thinking she wasn't worthy, that she didn't belong, and it had all been a deception. London stepped forward, placing both hands on the table between them. "You tried to erase me," she said, voice deadly calm. "You stole my inheritance. You rigged the legal system. You bribed officials. And you nearly had me killed." Walter shifted uncomfortably. Charlotte remained silent. London leaned in, her next words slow and deliberate. "I have the files. I have the evidence. And in 24 hours, so will the world." Silence. Then Charlotte laughed, a soft, cruel sound. "You think you can bring us down?" she sneered. "We own this city." London smiled, a smile that held power. "You did," she said, "but not anymore." Then she pulled out her phone and pressed send. Within minutes, the internet exploded. News outlets, social media, blogs, independent journalists, every bribe, every fraudulent deal, every corrupt politician they had funded, exposed. By morning, the FBI was at their doorstep. By noon, arrest warrants were issued. And by nightfall, the Hart Empire had crumbled. London had done what no one thought was possible. She had won. London didn't just reclaim her inheritance. She tripled it. With the settlements from her lawsuits, the seized assets, and the stock she strategically acquired, she built an empire of her own. But this time, she did it right. She reinvested in Black-owned businesses. She built scholarships for underprivileged students. She created wealth, not just for herself, but for others like her who had been denied opportunities. And when she walked back into the Hart estate, now hers, she didn't just take a seat at the table. She owned the entire building. Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong. Never let racism, corruption, or injustice define your worth. And most importantly, revenge is best served in cold, hard cash. What would you have done in London's position? Would you have taken revenge or simply walked away? Let's talk in the comments. And if you love stories about beating the system and winning, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning. Stay legendary.